Good afternoon, good evening, and welcome back to the afternoon session. Draw your attention, this is item 10, which is a seminar on sustainability of meat and livestock production. The seminar is being held as part of the agenda and follows the initiative taken by the specialised section over recent years to use the forum to consider broader issues and emerging trends facing governments and industry that potentially impact the facilitation of international trade. With previous forums in Geneva, Ireland, Potsdam on meat quality for sustainable future and a sustainable international e-trade for meat. May I extend a special welcome to the seminar for those online who have not been participating in the standardised section for meeting thus far. Please feel free to engage and raise the questions as appropriate. Electronic hands up and notes in the panel. It's now my pleasure to introduce Elizabeth Turk, the Director of Economic Cooperation and Trade Division, to present some opening remarks.
Many thanks, Jan. Many thanks, Chair. A warm welcome also from my side. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to this seminar on sustainable meat and livestock production, a seminar that is held as part of the 30th session of UNECE's specialized section on standardization of meat. And this specialized section is a subsidiary body of UNECE's Working Party on Agricultural Quality Standards. We call it Working Party 7. Now, what's the context? What's the background to today's seminar? On the one hand, I'd like to recall that in 2015, United Nations member states adopted the so-called 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And that 2030 Agenda includes the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, that really shape the work of our activities here at the UN. These SDG goals, they are interrelated, covering the economic, the social, and the environmental spheres. Secondly, in last year, the UNECE Commission, our highest governing body, decided to step up efforts to promote circular economy approaches and the sustainable use of natural resources. And the Commission asked the relevant sectoral committees and subsidiary bodies, in that case, Working Party 7 and the specialized section we are meeting here today, to consider how to enhance the impact of relevant existing UNECE instruments in order to foster circular and more resource-efficient approaches. It also called upon these subsidiary bodies to replicate and scale up existing approaches through capacity building and knowledge sharing activities. So today's seminar really allows us to respond to those two major developments. First of all, to several of the Sustainable Development Goals, including SDG 2 on hunger and nutrition, SDG 12 on sustainable consumption and production, and SDG 13 on climate. And the seminar also relates to the topic of sustainable and circular use of natural resources in response to our Commission mandate. Now, what exactly is the objective and what will we be discussing? Well, meat and livestock production is an important part of our food systems, is really important for nutrition as a key source of proteins and a number of vitamins. However, as we also see, it's increasingly debated, and there is discussion about meat and livestock production also having significant environmental impacts involving higher carbon footprint than, for example, the production of vegetables. Now, if we want to be in line with the goals set by the Paris Agreement, the world needs to halve greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050. And with food production linked to about a quarter of emissions, the sector is really facing increased pressure to find solutions for lowering its environmental footprint, including as regards greenhouse gas emissions, methane from meat and livestock production. Now, at the same time, we know that food systems are really complex. They are also complex to analyze, and particularly regarding their climate impacts. For example, the difference in growing conditions might mean that emissions from crop production can differ between countries, can differ between regions. Also, the impact of, for example, livestock depends on what animals eat, and even if they graze marginal land, or if they eat feed produced on land that could be used to produce food, all these impacts, all these variables might matter when we try to do an assessment. Agricultural land can also work as a carbon sink, but that positive impact of agriculture can also be difficult to estimate, and data is lacking. Now, these are some of the really important issues which I very much hope that today our eminent experts will speak to. And to recall, the objective of today's seminar is really to discuss issues related to greenhouse gas emissions from meat and livestock production, to discuss a little bit the science of measuring and accounting for the emissions, as well as possible mitigation options. And that really links nicely to our work at UNECE, which sort of focuses on agricultural quality standards that stretches back many, many decades. But while this standards is core of the work, I'm delighted to also see that this specialized section is looking at these important topics of sustainability and looking at how or whether that could be integrated in its work, and how this all also relates back to Agenda 2030 and the 69th Commission session that I mentioned before. Totally understand that 2 hours is not enough for such a complex topic, and but I'm really happy to mention that today is a starting point, and I would very much hope that the important discussion that we are beginning here today with the help of the experts, that this will sort of allow us to look at this complicated issue on the basis of facts, and maybe also with a little bit less emotions involved. Now, the seminar will feed into discussions of the group on future activities. And I personally really look forward to the outcome of the seminar, to listening to it. I understand it's being recorded. And at the Secretariat, we very much look forward to continuing supporting the work of the specialized section in line with what you, distinguished member states, mandate us to do. So with this, thank you for your attention, and I wish very fruitful deliberations to this discussion here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for those opening remarks, and particularly for drawing our attention to the SDG 12, sustainable practices, and the importance of having international minimum sustainable guidelines for the meat sector. Firstly, let me commence by saying that the specialised section is committed to the Sustainable Development Goals and the objectives of the UNECE, and acknowledge that they now are an integral part of the quality standards, maintaining relevance in the global marketplace. In this regard, the specialised section continues to develop, review, and update standards to ensure they remain practical and reflect the international supply chain requirements. This includes customer and consumer expectations. It's acknowledged that the sustainable food of systems is central to the achievement of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and the seminar therefore represents an opportunity to discuss sustainability as we focus on the estimates and mitigation options for carbon emissions from meat production. As I've stated, I believe that in the absence of science, myths will rule. Hence, I believe, and I'm delighted to have 5 international speakers, all experts in their respective fields, leading to commercial solutions and sustainable benefits. They're namely Pierre Edar, Frank McLenna, my apologies, Frank, John Gillooland, Joanne Barber, and Marg Will. May I thank each of you in advance for agreeing to share your knowledge and experience. The creation of cost-effective solutions for food production to match the needs of growing populations is of great interest in reducing emissions for a healthier atmosphere, the safety of farm workers, as well as providing sustainable meat production systems. The information for the seminar will be used by the specialised section to identify potential work/alliances going forward. May I therefore introduce our first speaker, is Professor Pierre Edler. I'll be very brief because the biographies are available elsewhere, but Pierre is part of the Global Observation on Accurate Livestock Sciences. He's a director of Global Food and Agribusiness Network. He's an outstanding scientist and an entrepreneur. So may I welcome Pierre to take the platform.
Thank you very much, Chair, for the introduction, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present in front of this very distinguished circle. I do not intend to provide solutions to the topics that we are dealing with, but I do want to introduce a few tools and other sessions of where we're working on solutions and showcase some pathways that can guide us towards solutions. May I ask before I proceed whether my loudspeaker is fine, that the audio is good?
Yes, the audio is good. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. So the key word was already mentioned in the introduction, that if we want to square the circle of providing enough food to our growing global population and at the same time achieve minimal environmental impacts in such a way and reach a situation where we have sustainability in the utilization of natural resources, then the way to get there is to achieve circular economies, to make our agricultural systems part of a circular flow of materials, so that in the circularity we do not create build-ups of chemical elements in reservoirs. Now that's a complicated way of saying, if we build up, for instance, carbon in the atmosphere, then we get negative impacts, for instance, in terms of climate warming. If we build up nitrogen in the soils, then we get negative impacts in terms of disturbing the natural balances of these soils and in the waters that drain from these soils. So whenever an agricultural process leads to the artificial and massive building up of chemical elements in a natural reservoir, then we're likely to create problems. And the idea of a circular agricultural system has to be that we prevent such building up of chemical elements where they do not belong. Now, while the generic term is sort of easy to understand, it was already mentioned that the actual solutions on the ground are very complex. They involve social dimensions, they involve economic dimensions, political dimensions, and then, of course, various natural and environmental dimensions. And we have to do all of this while we actually produce food. So I want to highlight the fact that these solutions will always be regional. We need to create solutions country by country, species by species, and maybe even by seasonal deviation. So one solution that works in a particular season in a country may not be a solution for another season in that country. So we need to be highly specific in order to be able to develop such regional and species-specific solution pathways. We need data that help us to understand what is the situation on the ground. And for that purpose, I want to introduce to you the Planet Food System Explorer that has as a mission to provide exactly this kind of data so that analysts, scientists, strategists can access these data and use them as part of creating local solutions. So if you bear with me for a few minutes, that I can introduce to you how this Planet Food System Explorer functions, and I invite the global community concerned with sustainable livestock to make free use of this tool. It is available freely on the internet, and everybody can access it and use it for their purposes. I also want to say, however, it is under development, so it keeps on gaining new functionalities and more refinements as we go. So here's this tool. It's the global food system represented in a Sankey diagram. The idea is that any kind of food that ultimately here is being eaten by people, at some earlier stage, it has been produced on some kind of an agricultural land. So we have croplands, we have pasture lands, we have forestry and marine environments where the food is produced as an original crop. So all these bars that you see here, they are proportional to the amount of kilotons of production. So I'm not sure if this is all visible on the screens because sometimes the mouse over does not transmit. But if I go with my cursor here, I see that there's 17.3 million kilotons of biomass being produced on croplands. So I can zoom into this. Oh, sorry. So these materials, they are being processed in mills and presses and so on and so forth. And then from these processing, they become food or also non-food items. But we also have other flows. We have oil meals that usually become animal feed. We have feed that become animal feed, and we have harvest byproducts that are all coming off the fields. So all of these flows are being generated somewhere, they're processed somewhere, and they become, they're utilized as a goods in the end. The basis for all of this data, most of this data comes straight out of the FAO-Stat databases. So this is what you're looking at is primarily FAO-Stat data plus additional research to estimate what the harvest byproducts are. Now, if this is the global flow picture of the system, we can now zoom into different kinds of crops by clicking on this. So if I want to look at cereals, oil crops, sugar crops, let's take cereals. And within the cereals, we can then look at the maize and the rice and the wheat. So let's look at rice. So here I now see the global value chain of rice for the whole world, how much rice is being produced. It's 1.6 million kilotons of biomass related to rice. Most of that is processed, so we don't usually eat raw rice, so we mill it. But we also have rice straws and other byproducts that partially get eaten by animals and partially become non-food items. Non-food items would be fertilizer, or would be fuels, or would be also remaining on the field. So we can work our way through 150 different types of crops, all based on FAO-Stat. We can look at starchy roots, cassava or sweet potatoes, and so on. Now, this is one way of how we can zoom into this. Another way is that we go country by country. So let me just, for the sake of it, we'll take the Philippines. And now we're looking at the food system structure for the Philippines and how much cropland production. They have cropland, Philippines, 175,000 kilotons of processing, oil meals, feed, harvest byproducts. And if we were to go into the Philippines more directly, we would see that oil crops play a big role. And if we then go deeper into oil crops, we would see that coconuts play a very big role in the Philippines. So, so we can look commodity by commodity and country by country. And then I want to add the third dimension, which is that we can then also look species by species. So if I now open up this block here of all the different biomass materials that go into the animals, we can also open this up into different species. So I can see now for the Philippines, so we're still on the Philippines in the year 2019. What kind of cropland production goes into poultry, into pigs, and cattle, and buffaloes. And if I want to understand, for instance, where all the biomass flows of the before mentioned coconuts will go, then we see that these that there's tiny amount of coconuts that go into poultry and into pigs. And now here I want to actually illustrate why this is important, because actually a lot of this harvest byproduct from coconut production in the Philippines could be utilized to increase animal production. So with technologies of feed enhancement, silage making, or milling, quite a lot of these harvest byproducts could be turned into animal feed. And this is not this is not an opportunity that is currently made use of enough, actually barely at all, according to the data that we can find in the international databases. So here, this is just one of the examples that I pick out, where we need to look species by species, country by country, commodity by commodity, and understand how we can utilize the existing biomass flows, such as coconut biomass flows, and utilize them better for animal production so that those animals can recycle the nutrients that are inside these biomass materials and produce food in the process, rather than all of these biomass materials ending up as non-food. Quite a lot of times when we talk about non-food, it actually becomes an environmental burden because it's just thrown away or just burned up instead of being valorized through the utilization of animals. I could be going through many different examples here. We have 180 different countries, 150 crops. We have all the major species. So this tool allows us to investigate exactly the specific basic data situation of which crop is fed to which animal in which country. And then starting from that point of view, we could be then looking at how can we increase circularity of these materials in order to increase animal production while decreasing environmental impact. I want to stop here. I do want to very quickly point out an initiative that quite a lot of us are involved with. So for further information, and there will be on the 19th and 20th of October in Dublin, an international summit on the societal role of meat, where we will be talking about environmental aspects, ecological aspects, accounting aspects, nutritional aspects, health aspects, ethical aspects, economical aspects. So we're looking at 2 days worth of discussions and presentations from more than a dozen prominent scientists. And I invite everybody to participate in the online presentations of the summit. The registration information will come out very shortly if you are interested in the program to listen to the presentations online. So for those of you who are interested to go deeper into the science, this is a place to find more scientific material. Thank you very much. I will stop here and I'm looking forward to the further presentations and the discussions afterwards.
Thank you, Pierre. Extremely good, and thank you for being informative. The biomass flows and the tool that you have certainly is very impressive. Talk about it for a long time, but we'll, for the sake of time, we'll just keep moving forward. We don't have any pressing hands up. Okay, that's good. Thank you. So now our second speaker would like to introduce Frank. That way it's easier just to refer to you as Frank. So he's a professor from the University of California, director of CLEAR. Frank's involved in specialist quality, air quality, and part of the cooperative extension in the Department of Animal Science at UC Davis in California. So welcome you to take the stage and make your presentation. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and everybody online. I was asked to talk about methane in particular, one of the main environmental issues around livestock, one that's certainly in the public discussion, and was asked to spend 20 minutes on this, and I will try my best to limit it to this. So when it comes to the warming impact of livestock, then one gas is in particular important, and that is methane. When it comes to methane, it's oftentimes compared to other greenhouse gases using a so-called matrix called the global warming potential, or in short, GWP 100, and I will refer to that repeatedly. What GWP 100 does is it gives a factor to methane, namely 28, and it says that methane is 28 times more potent than CO2. So let's say if a source produces 10 tons of methane, then that equates to 280 tons of CO2 equivalent units. And so while I agree that methane is a potent greenhouse gas, it is not just 28 times more potent than CO2, but there is more nuance to it. And allow me to share some of that. What this slide here shows is the global methane budget. And what you see here is that on the left side, there are numerous sources of methane, including fossil fuel production, agriculture and waste, biomass burning, wetlands, and so on. And all these sources that emit methane annually do so at the rate of 500 and let's call it 560 teragrams. You see this left half bubble on top. So, and this is where the narrative generally stops, when indeed it shouldn't stop there, because methane is not just produced, methane is also destroyed. On the right side, you see that globally 500 and almost 550 teragrams are destroyed. So 560 are produced, 550 are destroyed, and that leaves the balance of 10. That's a number we still seek to further reduce, but certainly one that's drastically different than focusing on the source emissions alone. If you now look on the right side under total sinks, there's a large arrow pointing down, and underneath it says sink from chemical reactions in the atmosphere. And what this means is that there's an atmospheric removal of methane, a destruction process for this gas, and that occurs almost at the rate of production. As long as methane is produced from constant sources, the production and destruction of this gas are almost equal. The time when you get into trouble with methane is if methane over time increases. Let's say if a given source was 1 million cattle, it increases to 1.5 million cattle, that would be an increasing source of methane over time. But in most places of the developed world, methane is actually either held stable or it's decreasing. In some developing regions of the world, where particularly inefficiencies occur of livestock production, methane can go up. So the fact that the removal of methane is oftentimes not considered brought some of our colleagues from Oxford University onto the stage as saying the way that we are characterizing the impact of methane on warming, on global warming, is inaccurate. They criticized the GWP 100 approach and said that GWP 100 overestimates the impact of a constant source of methane on global warming by a factor of 4. And they suggested a new matrix called GWP star, which actually does look at what methane does in a given locality over time. Let's say 1980 versus 2000 versus 2020 and so on, and the actual impacts on temperatures. And you will see in a few slides how this old matrix GWP 100 that the world has been using for the last 30 years compares and contrasts to the new, which is called GWP star. Before I go to any more detail, I just wanted to say that the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, IPCC, last year in their so-called AR6 report confirmed those concerns by those Oxford colleagues. And they said on page 123 of this AR6 report that indeed if you use a constant source of methane and GWP 100 to characterize it, that you are overblowing the impact on warming by a factor of 3 to 4. So it is actually now in the IPCC report that GWP 100, the matrix that we've been using for the last 30 years, can significantly distort the impact that particularly constant sources have, but also the impacts that increasing and or decreasing sources can have. And you can see on this page here, GWP star being quoted numerous times. Anyhow, so what is the issue around not accounting for atmospheric removal of this gas? Let me explain really quickly the difference between two key gases. The one is CO2, carbon dioxide, and the other one is methane, that will follow in a second. So imagine you driving your car to work on Monday, day one. When you do, you put CO2 into the atmosphere. On Tuesday, you drive the same distance and you put additional new CO2 into the atmosphere, which is now in addition to the stock from the previous day. On Wednesday, you drive again, adding new additional CO2 to the existing stock from the day before, 2 days before, the week before, the month before, and so on. You get the gist of it. What this means is that every time we burn fossil fuel, we add new additional carbon to the atmosphere. That's what makes CO2 a so-called stock gas. Currently, methane is treated in most public policy scenarios as if it were a stock gas too, as if every time, let's say, our cattle belch, we were to add new and additional methane to the atmosphere. But is it a stock gas? The answer is no, methane is not a stock gas. Methane is not just produced, but also destroyed. And that makes methane a so-called flow gas. So if the emission source is stable, let's say a stable cattle herd in a certain location, then we are not adding additional warming, but we are keeping the warming stable. And this is really important when you look at the Paris Climate Accord, for example, which calls out for human activities to not cause additional warming. So what is it that we need to do to keep us from adding additional warming from the livestock sector? That's really a question that's very important to answer. Let me just show you really quickly how two different sources of these greenhouse gases, CO2 and methane, respectively, correlate to the warming that they cause. If you have an increasing source of CO2, let's say a power plant that increases production over time, then that leads to an exponential increase of the related warming. A linear increase of a methane source causes an equal linear increase in warming. If you, however, have constant sources of CO2 and methane is CH4, then the constant source of CO2 causes increasing warming over time. Increasing because it's a cumulative gas, it's a stock gas, whereas a constant source of methane causes a constant amount of warming. So you can see already that these two gases behave quite differently in the atmosphere under rising and under stable conditions. The third scenario is one that I find most interesting. If you look at the red line here, let's say a source like a power plant were to ramp down over 30 years or so, and eventually it's shut down, then what would the related warming look like? The related warming from this decreasing CO2 would still go up, 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 and up until you shut this CO2 source down, this power plant in this case. And once you shut it down, then the residual CO2 still warms the planet at constant rates. And now contrast that to a decreasing methane source. Let's say if we have cattle herds and we are reducing their methane emissions through feed additives or through anaerobic digesters. When we reduce methane, we instantaneously reduce warming. I think it's very clear here that CO2 and methane behave very differently in the atmosphere insofar or in the ways that they warm the planet respectively. A reduction of methane can become a solution in our climate efforts to reduce temperatures. Now I contrast the two, the GWP 100 versus the GWP star, and I use three scenarios. The one where over 30 years we're increasing methane by 35%. The second one is one where it's relatively stable. We slightly reduce methane by 10. And the third one, we strongly reduce methane by 35%. GWP 100 would predict that in all three scenarios, we're adding a lot of additional CO2 equivalent emissions to the atmosphere. If you contrast this now to GWP star, the matrix from Oxford, then you see that only in the top scenario, these two agree. When you hold stable your methane or slightly reduce it, you don't see any blue north of the x-axis, meaning no additional warming if you hold stable your methane. If you slightly reduce it, then you have a slight negative number here. And negative means negative warming, which is a fancy word for cooling. If you strongly reduce methane, then you strongly reduce warming. That's like pulling carbon from the atmosphere, much as if you were to plant trees, forests, which also take carbon out of the atmosphere. This is what we do when we reduce methane. We actually reduce warming, and this gives us a significant leverage in animal agriculture to be part of a climate solution. If we reduce methane by enough, then that induces a lot of negative warming, which is a good thing, offsetting other greenhouse gases such as nitrous oxide or CO2. If methane reductions are strong enough, they can lead to climate neutrality of a farm or a farming sector. If you go even beyond that, even lower than reaching climate neutrality, then you can offset your carbon credit to other sectors, which is, by the way, something that we already do in California. Speaking of which, in California, we have very strict rules and regulations, especially around methane. The most recent one is a law that mandates a 40% reduction of methane to be achieved by the year 2030. So in 8 years from now, we have to reduce methane from all sectors by 40%, 40. Can this be done? The answer is yes, it can be done, and it has already started. Our government was wise enough, our legislature was wise enough to work not against farmers with a cane approach of using rules, regulations, and fines, maybe taxes, but to use the carrot approach of financially incentivizing reductions of methane. The state partnered, for example, with our dairy industry and financially assisted the sector to put in techniques and technologies to reduce methane. One of such you see here on this slide. This is an average dairy in California, and our dairies are large. They have about 1,500 milking cows on average. And what you see here is an area that used to be an open lagoon where the manure was stored. Now it's not open, it's covered. And what you see bulging out here is biogas. And 60%, 60 of this biogas is methane, and methane is flammable. But instead of just burning the methane and making it into power like we do in many places of Europe, this biogas is not just burned, but it's first converted into a fuel type for semi-trucks, for buses, and so forth. And once it does go into buses and semi-trucks, it replaces diesel. So not only do you reduce emissions from the farms, but you are now also reducing emissions from the transportation sector. And as a result, the state of California has put out a carbon credit system called low carbon fuel standard credits. And these credits run so high that they make up additional revenue, or they produce additional revenue that's about half of what farmers get for the sales of their milk. So there's an income stream that's significant, and that means our farmers are flocking into this technology. And it has already led to significant achievements, namely 30% of the dairy sector's methane goals have been reached so far, and we just started this 3 years ago. So this will continue, and we will achieve our 40% reduction of methane by the year 2030. And I want to remind you what that looks like. If you reduce methane by this much, on the bottom left, then you achieve what you see on the bottom right. And so we are on a path to achieving climate neutrality. This is what it looks like when you have a fueling station that puts dairy, renewable natural gas into heavy trucks, replacing diesel. It's not just a question of using or changing what we do with manure, but also that we use technologies to reduce enteric emissions, which is the emissions that are belched out by cattle and other ruminants. Here you see a couple of feed additives that have been tested at UC Davis, with some of them with great effectiveness. I do believe that in the next 5 years, we will have a toolbox available to our farmers to significantly reduce, and I mean 20, 30% or so, of enteric methane from our livestock. So that will be another method in addition to what we do with animal manure. If you now, in addition to this, figure in that improved grazing and so on can sequester more carbon, I think that we will be in a position where we can help our farmers significantly reduce their climate footprint and maybe offset the emissions of other more fossil fuel related industries. This here is what it looks like, the trajectory our dairy industry is like in California. On the x-axis, you see the years. On the y-axis, you see greenhouse gas warming equivalents. In gray, you see business as usual. Okay, so what if we weren't changing anything? If we wouldn't do anything to manure or to enteric, then we would not reach climate neutrality. We would continue to be in a position that we produce additional warming. But if we reduce methane by 40% from manure, then the light blue scenario will take place. And you can see that by 2027, we will cross the x-axis and now be on the side of producing negative warming. That means net reducing warming. If we were to do both, reducing manure methane as well as a 10% reduction of enteric methane, then the dark blue scenario would take place. And we are now on course to achieving just that, to most likely reach climate neutrality by the year 2027. By 2027, the California dairy industry, which is the strongest in the United States, will reach a point by which they don't produce additional warming anymore. And I see that being a signaling to other states in the United States and other places throughout the developed world to follow suit, to develop policies that incentivizes the use of methane reductions. We have published this latest effort here recently in the Journal of Dairy Science. You can access, of course, this paper, and we explain exactly what kind of tools we have to use and what kind of tools we should incentivize farmers to use in order to achieve climate neutrality. So with that, one last slide, I just wanted to point out, I'm the director of the CLEAR Center at UC Davis. I have been a professor at UC Davis for 20 years. I have established this CLEAR Center which has two cores, research and extension / communications. If you go onto our webpage, which is outlined here, then you will find many explainers, blogs, and so on, informational material that explains not just what we can do on the climate side of things, but also around other livestock and sustainability issues. With that, I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to answering any questions later. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Frank. It was a very informative presentation. And I mean, it's amazing to think that with the methane reduction, that there are significant benefits, not just to global warming and climate warming, but to commercial reality. And I guess at the end of the day, that's the driver that we need to actually get adoption and therefore the benefits flowing on. Just a question before we go forward. Have we got any pressing questions with hands up on the? Okay. So happy for questions to remain at the end. That will be very helpful for all round. So now I'd like to introduce the next speaker, which is John Gillooland. He's the Director of Agriculture and Sustainability in Denver Nutrition. John is a leading light in the environment space in the UK and Ireland, and managing world-leading carbon measurement and trading approaches. Again, there's further information about his biography available. So I'll pass over to you, John, to make a presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you very much for the organisation to invite me along and allow us to share our journey and just to build on what Frank has already shared. So I'm not going to look at methane or mitigation. I'm going to focus on actually how do we increase carbon stocks within livestock production farms. Next slide. I want to start, first of all, net zero. Everyone uses the word now, net zero, but a lot of people don't necessarily understand what it means. It's a bit like everyone uses the word sustainability today, but every person you ask will give you a different definition. So I want to give you my definition of net zero in 3 simple slides. I want to start first on this graphic. It's about gross emissions, and that is where on my farm and all other farms, we add up all the greenhouse gas emissions from our CO2 coming from using fossil fuels in our vehicles, using fossil fuels to heat our buildings, through the methane, through enteric fermentation from the animals, from manure management, from nitrous oxide, particularly where we put synthetic nitrogen onto wet soils. And that currently is what farm businesses are reported on today. Next slide, please. The second part of net zero is actually the flip side, what I call gross segregation. Our landscapes are full of plants. Those plants photosynthesize, they lock up carbon, they release oxygen. Yes, when my cattle come along, they graze some of that carbon, they belch out some methane, but actually if I do my job right, I might actually lock up more carbon than I belch out in methane. And that's what we call gross segregation. Currently, it is not measured, it's not reported, it is deemed too hard to measure, yet it is recognized in the same report that Frank was talking about by the IPCC in 2021. And they do say it is critical, if we're to achieve net zero, that farmers and their landscapes need actually not just reduce their emissions, but to increase the carbon stocks on their farm. Next slide, please. So for me, my definition of net carbon is actually where the sum of my emissions equals the sum of segregation, and adjusted for any fossil fuel CO2 emissions that we displace by using renewables. For me, quite clearly, that is not about zero emissions. And when I do a lot of work in the media, most of the media assume that net zero is zero emissions. It isn't. And really for us, the opportunity was, how do we measure this with integrity, credibility, and actually communicate this? And how do we do it in a way that we build our carbon stocks? Next slide, please. So Devon's Nutrition is a livestock research and nutrition company based in Ireland. And we believe the best way to do it was actually to go and buy a farm and take it on a journey to net zero. In 2013, we bought a farm, a very typical farm in Ireland, predominantly grass, animals grazing that grass with trees and hedges. What we wanted to do, I joined the company in 2013, and it was to create a vision that would deliver net zero beef and lamb production by 2025. Key in that was creating a journey that delivered multiple public goods at the same time. Because quite clearly, society is concerned, but they're not just concerned about climate change. They're concerned about soils, they're concerned about water quality, they're concerned about biodiversity. They're also concerned about the heritage that lies within many farm landscapes. The farm that we bought had an extra issue around it. It is also a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And that actually very much colored the journey we went on and the journey of exploration and innovation that we came to deliver both net zero and improve our heritage within the landscape. Next slide, please. So key in this for us is, if you cannot measure, you cannot manage. Society wants our sector to go on a journey. We have to go on that journey. The issue is, how do we know that we've gone on that journey, what direction we're going, and at what speed? You need to create a baseline. For us, we wanted to create robust landscape scale scientific baselines. In our case, when we started this journey in 2013, 2014, it was colored, as I say, by the fact we were a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So we tied up as agriculturalists with archaeologists. And when we brought two different disciplines with one goal, we had great creativity. And as a consequence, we visited digital technologies that I, as a farmer, had never heard of. Aerial LiDAR surveys, which are laser surveys. So in the case of a satellite, you scan one scan per 10 square meters. In the case of LiDAR, we're doing 40 scans per square meter. So the degree of sophistication and accuracy is astonishing. We also brought in a team from Frankfurt in Germany to look at what was under the soil. And then we did the bit I like, which is the measuring of soil for its fertility and its for carbon. Next slide, please. So when you do this, you start to get really good data. And so what you can see in this table is the results. We were the first farm in the world to measure the trees and hedges in our farm using this digital technology called LiDAR. We did this in 2014, and you can see the results there. And quite interestingly, our woodlands actually had less carbon in them than our hedges. If you ever come to Ireland, we don't have that many woodlands, but we have a lot of hedges. And really started to knuckle down on what is it we've got. And then if you repeat those surveys every 5 to 7 years, you measure change. Then you can measure the additionality or not. And it is that additionality we are looking for. And we want to do it in a robust way that we have the ability then at some stage to start trading the additionality that we create on our farm. Next slide, please. So we have measured our trees and hedges. So then we started to measure our soils as guided by through IPCC, taking samples down to 30 centimeters. And again, when you actually go and do it, sometimes you get results that are not written in published papers. And our land had been in continuous grass production for 60 years. And IPCC say that soil carbon plateaus after 20 years under grass. Well, on our farm, our soil carbon was awful compared to its peers. And quite clearly, something was going differently wrong. And that was about management, not about land use. And I think sometimes we look at land use too much and not enough about land management, about the role of land managers. Next slide, please. So when you do this exercise, you create a balance sheet. And here is the asset side of our balance sheet on our farm. And you can see the grazing ground, the woods, the floodplains, the hedges in the soil. And then you can see the carbon in the above ground part on the hedges and woods. And when you convert that to carbon dioxide equivalents, we manage as farmers 60,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalents every year. That's not additional. That's what we manage. That's what we do as land managers. And we see ourselves as custodians of the nation's carbon, as do our fellow farmers. Next slide, please. So when you do that, then what you then want to work out is your additionality on an annual basis. Currently, until we repeat our baselines every 5 years, we won't be able to tell accurately. So we use segregation factors from peer-reviewed publications. And on our farm, we're sequestering 665 tons of carbon dioxide equivalents on an annual basis through this. That's what we call a tier 1 methodology, but it is our plan to get to tier 3 methodology, where we go back and repeat this every 5 years. We will find actual change over theoretical change. Next slide, please. So we are, our farm is an international lighthouse farm for Wageningen University Research. We're one of 12 farms on 5 continents. As a job of a lighthouse farm is to create a beacon of light on a pathway forward. So what we wanted to do is see, could we bring other farmers on this journey and other farmers of different enterprises. So we secured funding through the EIP Agri program in Brussels, supported by the Belfast government in Northern Ireland. And we're taking 7 farms on a journey, including my personal farm. I am a farmer in my own right, on a similar journey, but even more intense than the previous one. Next slide, please. And this is just to give you an idea of the technologies we're using. So this is our aerial ortho imaging that switches to LiDAR. And you can see how we completely digitalize the landscape. And that allows us then to count every ton of carbon sitting in trees and hedges. And so I say, if you repeat that every 5 to 7 years, you measure change and you measure the additionality. Next slide, please. So this is the digitalization, the static digitalization of my own farm. My main enterprise is I grow willow trees for renewable heat. And you can see different crops, but you can also see the parkland trees of mine on my farm. And you get a very graphic image of where all your trees and hedges are. Next slide, please. And so what we've done, we've taken the journey further than we did in Douth. So you can see in my hedges, we've categorized them into 4 different shapes and sizes, individual trees. And you can see how detailed we can actually get this. And when you can see there then on the bottom right-hand side that we are managing about 1,400 tons of biomass in our trees and hedges. Next slide, please. We then went to our soils again, but this time moving the technology on. If anyone has ever gone and done soil carbon sampling by hand, you can see the gentleman on the left-hand side, he has rather excessive muscles, but that was as a consequence of taking all these soil samples. This is a laborious job. On the right-hand side, you can now see that startup entrepreneurship has come along fully automated it. So instead of needing manpower going down to 30 centimeters, we've got hydraulic horsepower going down to a meter. So really being able to tell what is the story going on with carbon, not just the 30 centimeters requested by IPCC, but right down to a meter to see how deep the carbon is going. And particularly as we switch to herbs and legumes, particularly herbs, we're seeing herbs constantly having root depths of 40 and 50 centimeters that you are not picking up if you only stop at 30 centimeters. Next slide, please. And so when you do that, and you categorize your land, not only in land use, but on land management, you start to see differences on how we use our land and what is the consequence. I mean, when we started taking farmers on this journey, they said, all right, now we know our soil carbon, what do we need to do to put more in it? So that when you come back in 5 years' time, I've got another 10% or 15%. So what we're doing here is these farms who've got data over the last 10 years in both land use and land management. And we're clearly seeing that there are some land uses that leave you with more carbon. There are some land managements that leave you more carbon, and there's some that don't. And quite interestingly, the role of the grazing animal defecating on soil is increasing carbon stocks quite dramatically than where you cut the vegetation and take it to a barn and feed the animals inside. So the role of the grazing animal is really significant. Next slide, please. So when you bring all this data together, and here are 6 farms that we've got here, and you can see in the middle column are gross emissions. So these are what the farms are reported on. You can see there are 2 dairy farms there. There's a beef farm, beef with sheep, arable with beef, and then my own farm, Willow, with dry cows for the dairy industry. And then in the next column, you can see the total gross segregation. And what I want to get all farms to is this position of net emissions. That is where you take the gross segregation away from the gross emissions. And you can see right over on the right-hand side, the 2 dairy farms are their net position is 27% below the gross. The intensive beef is 33%. The beef and sheep farm is 56%. The arable farm is 59%. And my own farm is already 3% beyond net zero today. If I were to add in the benefits of my renewables, which I haven't in this, my farm is 560% beyond net zero today. What is very clear is all farms are on different parts of their pathway here. There is no silver bullet. There is a toolbox of many tools, and we need to unshackle farmers to go in and use the tools that are relevant to their region, to their farm. Some farms will never reach net zero, and others will go way beyond it. And it's very important that we encourage the farms that can do this is to go way beyond it, because some farms will never reach it, and we will need to find a trading scheme or something to balance that out. Next slide, please. So we've been looking to scale this up. I've been very fortunate. I'm a policy advocate and advisor as well as what I do for Devonish and what I do in my own farm. And earlier this year, our Minister of Agriculture and the Environment in Northern Ireland announced that he was going to baseline every single field, every single tree, every single hedge in Northern Ireland. It's called the Soil Nutrient Health Scheme. It's an investment of £45 million of public funds to put a baseline in with the plan that we will repeat that every 5 years, and we will measure credibly change, whether it be positive, whether it be negative. What is really interesting in the scheme for the first quarter of Northern Ireland, because we're doing it over 4 years, it closed at the end of August. 92% of farmers applied for the scheme. So it is unprecedented in its ambition, and it's unprecedented in the farmer engagement. Next slide, please. But there's a catch, and it's really pertinent that I'm sitting within the United Nations today. Is not only do farmers and land managers have to go on this journey, but so do policymakers and regulators. All governments use a tool that was designed by the United Nations called the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory. A lot of people have not really got their head around it. This I have cut and paste. This is taken out of the greenhouse gas national inventory in Ireland. If I have the next slide a moment. And what I've highlighted there is 4 different areas: energy, agriculture, land use change and forestry, and waste. The reason I've highlighted that is the way the national inventory accounts. It accounts for sectors in the economy that are narrow, that are not diverse, and it counts things in vertical silos. So when you actually come along, next slide, please. When you actually come along with a dynamic livestock business who will have activity in 4 totally different silos. So if I take a livestock farm that also has landscape where it's sequestering, it also has anaerobic digestion, it's treating waste, and it's also got renewables, that business cuts 4 totally different silos. Currently, within the structure of the greenhouse gas national inventory, there is no methodology for reading horizontally across. So a farm business is not at the moment allowed to use renewables, carbon sequestration, or waste to offset the unavoidable emissions coming for the rumen. And that isn't fair. And my plea is to unshackle farmers to allow them to use every tool in the toolbox. Is yes, they have to reduce nitrous oxide and methane. Yes, they have to reduce fossil fuels by using renewables. Yes, they have to increase carbon stocks. And yes, they have to manage their waste better. They need a scheme that rewards them in their totality of doing that and not by single silos. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I'll just skip this one. So my final slide, Chairman, is if we really want to look at achieving net zero and we want to increase carbon stocks, a couple of things I really want to flag up. Currently and historically, increasing carbon stocks is the poor political brethren to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. All the emotion is around reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And we do need to do it. But we also need to increase carbon stocks. And it needs now to get the same amount of political attention as reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It is absolutely vital that we need to do those simultaneously. There are considerably larger knowledge gaps in carbon sequestration than there are emissions. But once we get our head around this, we will get considerable cost reduction. We will design smarter measuring, reporting, and verification frameworks. And it's absolutely essential that the policy framework goes with us and it matures and shapes as the innovation comes forward and allows farm businesses to use every tool in the toolbox and not quarter of the tools in the toolbox. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Thank you, John. That was, again, very informative and a different, slightly different approach to the topic, but seemingly using innovation and technologies and concentrating on practical applications on a farm is something that I guess would excite every farmer for that matter. So again, any pressing questions flagged up at the moment? Okay, let's just for the sake of time keep moving so we can have a good discussion at the end. So now I'd like to move to introduce the next speaker, Ms. Joanne Barber, and she's the Chief Operating Officer of Future Feed in Australia. Joanne is passionate about sustainability. She's an advocate, a thought leader within the wellness and organics industry. She has a strong and a great breadth of knowledge. And again, her bio will be available more fully, but just welcome Joanne to present her presentation around Future Feed. Over to you if we can pick up her. Joanne, thank you.
Sorry, we can't hear anything. Do you have? Moderator, do you hear anything? No. Can you try without the headphones? Maybe, if it's a connection problem. There's no sound.
Maybe you should increase the volume of the your computer.
Now you're muted, Joanne, but can you try to increase the volume of your computer and then try again? There's no sound.
Elle a pas de son.
Should we swap the order and try to solve the technical problem?
Okay, thank you. Just having a little technical difficulty getting connected with Joanne. So again, in the interest of time, we're going to just move forward and produce, ask Marg Will if she'd come forward in the pecking order, so to speak. So Marg Will, she's committed herself for many years to the organic industry. She's provided assistance to businesses in organics and considering becoming organic, provided support to businesses seeking sustainability and ESG verifications. And she runs a business in Australia supporting those issues. So she has a presentation on verification and validation. So Mark, if I can ask you to take the platform, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the UNECE and the Specialised Standardisation of Meat Committee for inviting me to be here today. Just before I kick off, I'd also like to just note that first slide that's up at the moment, the background is actually part of the Channel country in Australia, and that's the Diamantina River that's usually quite dry and in drought, and that's the spread of the water through all that whole river system there. And I urge anyone online or here today to go and look up the Channel country in Australia. It is really one of those natural wonders of the world. Next slide. Sustainability. The concept of sustainability has many interpretations, most having emerged over the last 10 years. What we know, however, is sustainability is more than buying carbon credits. Sustainability is more than going paperless. Sustainability is more than consuming less. Sustainability is more than recycling packaging. Sustainability is more than counting food miles. Sustainability can be best described as a holistic system for continuous concurrent improvement. Better standards, cleaner systems, rigorous processes, and adherence to all elements of environmental, social, and governance commitments. Sustainability goes beyond single issues. It incorporates regenerative agriculture practices for soil health, incorporates elements of organic, animal welfare, fair trade, ethical, biodiversity, natural capital, and assessing climate risk over the whole of production chain. It includes fair employment, community engagement, and governance. When applying a holistic approach to sustainability, investigation of the environmental, social, and governance or ESG impacts to a business need to be assessed and outcomes focused. Think about a company that makes a carbon neutral claim by offsetting, but continues to release direct air and water emissions and has increased energy use without consideration for continual improvement. Ultimately, the failure of addressing the ongoing whole of life cycle emissions and other ESG factors, such as the social targets and goals, will result in nothing more than virtue signalling. ESG can apply to every sector. It's the next stage in the old triple bottom line theory and has significant impact in the investment and finance sectors. The meat and livestock sectors can also adapt this concept. Here, the session is around Sustainability Development Goal number 12, responsible consumption and production. However, as food providers, the whole 17 SDGs must be considered. For example, here the graphic by Certified Sustainable demonstrates how primary producers and food processors might apply SDGs to their businesses. If we examine an SDG 1, no poverty, and SDG 2, zero hunger, we can see the opportunities for the meat and livestock industries to demonstrate positive actions towards the 2030 agenda. Next slide. Consumers are evolving. The demographic with the greatest purchasing power and attracting the most attention from big brands and organisations in 2022 are the millennials and younger. I found this on the web. Apparently that phone needs to stop. This is the generation who have never not known waste recycling bins. Sustainable behaviour and our outcomes are paramount to those under the age of 40. Major retailers around the world are reporting increased awareness around sustainability from consumers. However, according to recent studies, some 60% don't fully trust the claims that are being made. Next one. The demand and opportunity for strong and robust sustainable standards has never been greater and is set to increase. Producers and processors that adhere to such standards have the most to gain. Strong standards address consumer trust concerns. They help consumers identify those products which have met expectations around sustainability claims and create brand trust. Strong standards reduce greenwashing. Strong standards assist businesses with setting, evaluating and meeting ESG obligations and SDG targets. Over the past 2 decades, the meat and livestock sectors have seen many standards introduced through the value chain, including grass-fed, feedlot accredited, traceability, free range, meat language, hormone-free and food safety. However, the key difference between these and sustainability is the level of complexity, the diversity of the elements, and the holistic, inclusive approach needed. Strong standards are robust yet flexible. After 30 plus years of organic standards worldwide, there's much learning that can be applied to the development of sustainability standards. Best practice standard development processes need to be independently audited and have a competent authority to oversee that implementation. Strong standards for sustainability are regularly reviewed, updated, and allowed for regional variance. Robust procedures for evaluation, implementation, and administration of standards must also exist, with clear, transparent decision-making and facilitate engagement with all stakeholders. Independent third-party auditing and certification can eliminate conflicts of interest while verifying emissions and validating claims. Accreditation bodies offering sustainable certification should meet ISO 17065, universally accepted by governments. Strong standards are science-based and utilise the accepted universal methods for emissions calculations. Sustainable standards assess conformance based on best practice industry standards, benchmarks and guidance, such as IPCC, and for financial reporting, the draft IFRS. Long existing standards, such as the ISO 14001 series for environmental management and evaluations, offer valuable additional resources when developing ESG targets as part of a conformance to a sustainable standard. Strong sustainable standards are consumer friendly and readily accessible. The use of a recognised logo underpinned by a robust standard helps consumers identify high quality and truly sustainable products in the market. Increasingly, consumers are seeking out brands and organisations that deliver a social outcome around fair and equitable pricing and contribute to SDG 1 of no poverty. Strong sustainable standards encourage continuous improvement. Businesses meeting best practice sustainability standards are able to demonstrate target setting, methodology for achieving the targets, review and monitoring of the progress towards the targets, then identify opportunities for new targets. It could be argued that the meat sector of the food industry has always recycled, reused, and found a home for waste. Think about the number of products alone made from gelatin. Opportunities exist to build on this existing circular economy thinking to develop further innovation around meat products or non-meat products from livestock. Already we have processing facilities powered by waste, and we're seeing early work on food-grade plastics from cellulose waste. Strong, sustainable standards assist producers and processors to identify, quantify, and validate such innovations, providing strong data around upstream and downstream emissions and value. Common existing on-farm practices such as solar pumps, genetic and fertility improvements, pasture rotations, remnant vegetation management, remote water monitoring, and satellite vegetation mapping also need to be recognised for lowering the carbon footprint of operations. An example of applying the life cycle assessment post-production may be the vaccine manufacturers who utilise fetal blood or the other medical products obtained from livestock will eventually seek to verify the carbon footprint of such products as part of their own ESG reporting. By identifying and analysing scope 1, 2 and 3 of the product life cycles, producers and processors can demonstrate just where their emissions occur and set targets for reductions. Already we know from research that transport contributes to a large percentage of greenhouse gas emissions of food, as does packaging and food waste. We've heard of some of the products that meat and livestock sectors have developed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions today. The proactive approach that has seen innovations across the globe and sustainable standards will continue to encourage further developments. Strong, sustainable standards will drive the eventual equal footing of livestock and food against other industries. For example, what we've heard about today, the biogenic carbon cycle, photosynthesis, and carbon sequestration will all be considered alongside the benefits to soil from grazing. Perhaps science and data collection will demonstrate beyond doubt that just like bees are needed for pollination, cows and other grazing animals are needed for soil health. Excellent. However, I urge caution when implementing global sustainability standards. We see the market access issues currently with organic standards as countries implement individual regulations without consideration of other countries' production nor processing systems. Even just the difference on whether a standard is written prescriptive or descriptive affects how conformity assessment may be achieved between different countries and regions. Cost burdens are often cited as criticisms of obtaining certification, including the additional time needed to conform to a standard's required record keeping and administration. Removing the additional layers of government-to-government requirements and keeping sustainable standards under non-government administration will reduce these barriers. Strong, sustainable standards provide options for modern platforms to enable certified operators smooth engagement with the certification body. Strong, sustainable standards have robust auditing procedures, including relevant testing, to provide to a high level of checks and balances for operators. Enforcement and penalties for non-conformances are at the highest levels possible to discourage potential false claims. Use of an identifiable logo underpinned by a strong standard gives additional trademark protections for that standard and again supports the value proposition of the standard. The requirements for certification must be at all stages of the production chain and full traceability at every step. Validation through supplier declarations rather than validation and certification carries the risks of substitutions and potential greenwashing around ESG performance. Strong, sustainable standards do not stagnate. The ability to adapt to include new research, emerging technologies and innovation is critical. Standards reviews must happen regularly to keep in line with developments and the process is transparent to all stakeholders. There are currently major organic standards internationally that haven't updated allowed products for 20 years. And those listed as compliant in those very standards are no longer available in market. By combining ESG thinking with the SDGs and integrating world's best practice underpinned by continuous improvement into sustainability standards, people will have the tools needed to work towards a positive future for people, planet, and prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you, Marg. Again, the theme of taking regulatory constraints or regulatory conditions along for the journey are going to be very key to successful outcomes. So are we able to link with Joanne?
Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me?
Okay. So I now, with some relief, welcome Joanne Barber. As I said, she's the Chief Executive or Chief Operating Officer for Future Feed. And this is, in my book, a practical application, again, commercially driven. So very keen to hear from her. Joanne's been very passionate, again, I mentioned before, about sustainability. She's a great advocate for process. She's been involved in the wellness and organic industries for some time. So I welcome you, and thank goodness we've now got you. So over to you, Joanne.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Chair. I believe I have a presentation available there to share. Hopefully. Thank you. So I'd like to begin with acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, which I am coming from this evening or this morning. And I'd like to also pay my respects for the elders past and present. So our story I'm telling you today is a great success for the climate. It's Asparagopsis seaweed. Simple is a natural dietary solution for methane reduction. And I'm looking forward to sharing that. I think I have full control. If not, next slide. Yeah. So cattle and sheep, or ruminant livestock, have a unique ability to break down plant material. They take grass and they turn that into energy, dense nutrients, which is essentially called volatile fatty acids. And the byproduct of this process is methane. And so this is significant and accounts for, in Australia, 11% of our total emissions, but it is also 48% of Australia's methane emissions. So ruminants possess, as I said, that unique ability to break down those plant materials, but certainly at a cost to the climate. Next slide. So the industry is, is really collaborating domestically and globally on this mission. And the red meat sector and the dairy and wool industry is looking to act on these emissions for a number of reasons. As we've mentioned here, there is a great demand at a consumer level. There's offsetting and insetting to create that value creation and have a product for their market demand, for their supermarket stores that are demanding low methane product or low carbon product, and also those carbon and border adjustment taxes that may occur on these commodities in the future. And so there's a lot of nervousness around this, particularly in Australia, as we export most of our commodity in dairy and beef. And so the concern is if we don't act and do something now, that there will be, such a discount for the industry from exporting. From globally, we operate globally, so we have markets that are sensing those same types of fears and looking for these interventions that can help address up to 75% of their on-farm emissions quite immediately by this type of intervention. We can go to the next slide. So the great news is, yes, you've heard of red seaweed, or red plume, as it's known by Indigenous Australians, or Asparagopsis, as it's more, the genesis. And it is a really beautiful seaweed to not just see as it floats in the water, but this beautiful co-benefit that it can create, including if it was grown in combination at prawn farms, where in ponds, where it's cleaning up those ponds, absorbing certain nutrients. It's been then processed potentially into an oil-based product where the biomass is removed and used for biofuels, and then possibly or definitely the infused oil is then fed in as an animal feed, so to reduce methane. So you can see these beautiful co-benefits from this, and if anyone in the audience has much knowledge of the carbon industry in terms of carbon project managers and so forth, this type of story is a really beautiful story for them to be able to drive those credits out into the marketplace. Next slide. So what we have here is, taking a little step back just to take you on the journey on how this was founded. A farmer in Canada observed over time that his cattle, who were grazing by the ocean and foraging on seaweed that was washing up by the shore, were actually much more productive. They were calmer, they were producing more milk, there was less mastitis, better reproductive success, and he wanted to commercialize that seaweed. So he called on a friend of his, which is now our chief scientist, and that was Dr. Rob Kinley, who was at Dalhousie University at the time. And Rob arrived and also was very intrigued and interested in what was occurring on this particular property. And of course, his curiosity started to sort of think about some other questions that might come up for him, like what was happening with methane emissions. And so what he found was this particular seaweed that was washed up, which was an Asparagopsis, was giving around 10% reductions of emissions. So that sort of set off this quest for him. And if that was 10%, is there any seaweeds around the world that could give a higher reduction of methane? And that led him to Australia, essentially, where he was able to find an abundance of coastline here with native seaweeds. And he tested dozens of them, those seaweeds, and found the most award-winning, if you want to say, Asparagopsis seaweed, which is, beautifully grows in two types of seaweeds, in Taxiformis and Amata. And in cooler climates, the Amata will grow, and in warmer climates, the Taxiformis will grow. And in some parts of Australia, it can grow all year round because the cool and the warm seasonal temperatures of the oceans. So next slide, if you don't mind. That testing, I guess, moved him to Australia, where he teamed up with Meat and Livestock Australia, CSIRO and James Cook University to really sort of put this type of theory to test around these different seaweeds. And from there, CSIRO, who was working on a program, Elevate program at the time, moved Dr. Kinley into that program, and that's where they spun out this technology. So James Cook University, Meat and Livestock Australia and CSIRO are actually the patent owners, and Future Feed own that technology through those partners, and we commercialize that out to the industry. Next slide. So I want to share two of the very early foundational studies that occurred with Future Feed or with SARO, Meat and Livestock Australia and James Cook University, with Rob driving this technology. And what you'll see here is part of the in vitro study. You'll see the black line is actually the control group, and the grey is the treatment group. And you're actually seeing here a virtual elimination of methane. If you look at 70, 76, 84 and 96, that runs across the bottom, that's the hours in marks of reduction in methane. What that really caused them to do is say, okay, we can work this in vitro, but when you take it to the next trial, which is taking it to animal trials, you sort of can sometimes expect that you won't get the same types of results. Just going to in the next slide, we talk about, so we then moved into the animal trials. We had 20 head of cattle across 90 days on feed. And this surprisingly gave the scientists working on this at the time the results that actually really blew their minds. They weren't expecting the reductions in this space to be quite so much, but what we're seeing is, and they also didn't realize that it was going to take a much less amount of feed to get the reductions. So it was a real aha moment that for the Asparagopsis sector and for future feed, which is where we're really founded from. They really realized at this point that they had a technology that they could commercialize or had the commercial potential inside it. So those trials also started with safety and efficacy, because of course, they're the things that you want to know. What are the patterns and behaviors that may happen when you start to feed a new feed ingredient? And of course, Asparagopsis hadn't been grown commercially globally at all. There was a little bit happening in cosmetics, but certainly nothing industrial. So there was going to be a long road ahead. And so next slide. This is where we started to see, you know, that in 98% reduction with just 2% inclusion rate. They also started to see, this is where they got the productivity gains that they were looking to see as well, that they were hoping to see. And we're actually at this very moment in time conducting large-scale productivity trials to really prove out that the data that's required for commercial reasons. Of course, that's one of the reasons why a farmer would uptake this technology if productivity gain, feed efficiency is there, but also, you know, taking a brand new industry to the market is no cheap venture ahead. So pricing is always going to be one of the biggest hurdles we have to lean into as a sector, and it's certainly a collaborative approach here, because volume in scaling is the next really big stage that we're moving towards. It's the next slide. Well, I probably did jump ahead there in weight gain, but this is the slide where we're actually showing that this was improvements. Like we had a noisy number there of weight gains from anything from 10% right up to 20-25%. So we really this new productivity trial that we're moving towards will really help to manage that noisy number. But what we can share is that there's no taste changes to meat quality, or there's no taste change. Palatability of the product for the animal is the inclusion rates are so low that it's really not noticeable in the feed. And there's two formats. There's freeze-dried and there's Asparagopsis oil, which is gaining its regulatory sort of pathways at the moment in different areas in Australia, and then it will move to the EU and US next year. But the statistical relevance of a larger herd scale trial is what we were looking at, and repetition of the productivity as well. Next slide. So this is the team. It's actually grown another 30% since this slide. So apologies, I haven't updated it, but I guess you know, where Future Feed is we are a company that's been spun out by CSIRO. They have lots of incubation areas that spin off new technologies into companies, where they also help those companies find funding. Future Feed is one of those companies, and we now are led by some of the biggest companies in Australia. Harvest Road, which is Twiggy Forrest, one of our Australia's billionaires, Grain Corp, one of the largest oil producers, oil distributors in Australia, and grain. AGP Impact, which is a finance impact company, and CSIRO, and Woolworths, which is one of our major supermarkets here in Australia. And they are our board of directors, and they represent a different part of the value chain for this industry. So they bring a great deal of wealth of knowledge to the industry, and of course the finance as well. Future Feed enables the industry. So we are not a seaweed producer, we are not a feed manufacturer, nor a livestock producer. What we do is create the industry to provide the rules and the tools and the technology approvals through license agreements to impact partners such as seaweed growers or manufacturers. We then provide the regulatory pathways in different markets. So we open the regulatory pathways up by having the product registered in those markets. And we also provide the certification tools that sit across the sector. So this is the team. It's small, it's tight, and it's growing. But you know, these are some of the greatest minds that are sitting behind the technology today, as well as our licensees that are sitting out there, really amplifying the technology in the aquaculture space. Next slide. So some of those licensees that you see here, we have we have 3 licensees in Australia, we have 2 in US, 1 in Canada, 1 in the EU, and growing. We would have dozens on the go at the moment where we're looking at different production systems. Now in the beginning, all of these licensees currently were really first to put their hands up and say, right, let's really do this, let's collaborate. We can't sit back and watch this happen. And they didn't come from an aquaculture mindset. They came from a place of, we really need to do something, and we need to do something now. And so where we have also noticed that acceleration can happen is with aquaculturists that are already experienced in growing some other product, such as other seaweeds, or it could be prawns or salmon or tuna or oysters or whatever it might be, but those parallel production systems where they can actually grow asparagopsis side by side, and it can be complementary. In some cases, it's just a third stream income for that particular location, but we are starting to see this opportunity for our licensees to aggregate and have a bigger source of supply into their markets and help them scale up, as well as some of those cross-parallel production systems may look to have licenses in the future, including manufacturers as well, who can go out to the marketplace and aggregate the asparagopsis seaweed. Our technology becomes activated when you're feeding asparagopsis to ruminant livestock, and so, or you have the intention to feed the asparagopsis to livestock. Next slide. So I touched before on the different pillars that we have within inside our organization, where core of our business is around the research and development, the continual improvements that come with taking a brand new industry into the market. You know, it's not avoiding the other things that are really important to us, such as managing methane and manure, and considering different mixtures that may go out to farms in different regions in different parts of the world, whether it's mixed with molasses or it's in a lick block, or however that new product needs to move to the market, some of the areas that we're also trying to figure out in Australia is how to measure the methane emissions on a broad acre system. And that is the main way Australia operates at the moment. Our technology at the moment plugs quite sophisticatedly into feedlot systems and dairy systems, and the grazing systems, as I just mentioned, are still an area for somewhat the industry to work out, but also Australia Future Feed facilitates a lot of those discussions and is thought leading in many of those areas. Regulatory actually comes after research. So regulatory, it's not quite in the right order there, but regulatory basically says we have the product dossiers, we have the safety efficacy, we have the tolerance, we have everything that the regulator requires in order to process that product into an approved feed additive or feed material, depending on the country it's in. Certification comes after that, is, you know, regulatory, as we said, first and foremost. That must be in place before certification can be there. And certification for us is about ensuring that the traceability of the ingredient is to the right qualities that are intended for the reductions, that the life cycle assessment is addressed over the supply chain. So, of course, we're not producing asparaginopsis and creating emissions over here, but reducing them over in the livestock end. So it's really important that everyone's scope 1, 2, and 3s are really supported throughout this throughout the industry, and we can do that, right? We're a brand new industry, so we can set these systems up quite well at the beginning. It also allows the carbon accounting. So we provide a verification certificate to the livestock producer who's using the technology or the intervention on farm. We don't trade in credits. That's not something that we do. We just provide the rigor around the actual technology throughout the value chain. And then, of course, marketing, building the awareness for looking for that product in the marketplace that holds that logo, that on that meat tray or on that dairy product or whatever it might be, and providing the data and the reports to the industry to help benchmark and to grow a sector and then continue that investment inside the industry. Next slide. So some of our really big pain points at the moment are prioritization. There's different sort of, particularly say for Australia, Australia hasn't yet got an enteric methane methodology up and running. It's in the process of that. There's many trials going on, building out the metadata that supports there. We have in Australia a national supplement advisory group or working group that's combined with competitive brands to asparaginopsis, but we saw that there was a real need for collaboration. I think we all agree that there's no competition in this space at the moment, and that collaboration is the most important to solve some of the world's problems for today. We'll worry about competition when competition's close. Our regulatory is updates. We are constantly dealing with different regulatory markets, not just in product, but in permits for ocean harvesting and for permits for access for water. And these are some of all of the areas that our licensees are working on and we're supporting with. And it could be, you know, regulatory updates that are required for carbon accounting that we really see that in the future that they're going to be needed. Regulatory in terms of getting our standard recognised with our regulator here with ACCC, but also having that as an import and export standard and learning from, you know, some of our you know, companies out there that didn't make, so the organic industry didn't make their standard a domestic standard, it was an export standard. So just learning from mistakes of other sectors and, you know, continuing to build upon the knowledge that we have today. So the collaboration is simply key. There is nothing that we can do without government as a partner, industry in terms of our value chain, There is daily engagement with the likes of Dairy Australia or Dairy New Zealand or whoever it might be. There's a really big deal around the deep engagement with MLA, not because they're one of our technology owners, but they are they have a goal themselves for the red meat sector by 2030. So, you know, real collaboration is happening across the domestic market here in Australia, but the global market in general. We're seeing just absolute awe with, you know, movement at the station, as you might want to say. Investment now, in order to really push forward, regulatory needs to be in place for investment to continue to flow into these markets. So it really is that chicken and egg, and some of you know some of those areas we're seeing are really taking place, and we're seeing huge amounts of investment into this sector. What we want to see is a huge amount more investment into the sector, particularly in the growing national hatcheries and nurseries, really feeding into these markets. Tank-based is a great way to control the iodine levels and the other bioactives that are contained within inside the asparagopsis, which is quite unique. A lot of other seaweeds lose their bioactives quite easily, but it's quite encapsulated into the asparagopsis seaweed. And the next slide, that's it from me. I really think that this is an amazing story to tell. It's one of the many that I'm sure that will emerge from this this industry, but it's certainly an intervention that is inspiring for many. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. That was, again, inspiring to me. I just thank you immensely for updating where we are in regards. I always had some element of doubt in my mind about ultimately whether you would have difficulties with supply, but obviously you're working through those processes and through those licenses and I guess through different countries. But yeah, thank you very much. So we're fortunate enough to have some time, not a lot of time, but first and foremost, ask Secretary, do we have anybody with hands up with questions?
To remind perhaps participants, if they want to ask a question, they should press the raise hand button at the bottom of the screen.
But in the meantime, till we get a question, my thought process says that the word collaboration has come through on many of these journeys. I'll call them journeys because it's pretty clear that the different pathways from very practical applications in Ireland to activities such as Future Feed, and again, Marg Will reminding us about the importance of some verification and validation and certification process to ensure that we have the respect, I guess, of consumers. Right back to the beginning that Pierre raised about the biomass and again identifying how it's not necessarily universal or global. It's more about commodity to commodity and reminding us that in some instances it could be even species to species and fundamentally almost weather conditions to weather conditions. So there's a lot of things to be assessed. It is complex, but it seems like with new technologies, we're gaining a lot more information. And I guess picking up on what John said, my pick up from that is it's really important. It's nice to hear that Joanne's having good responses from regulatory involvement, but regulation has got to keep pace with the development of technologies. And again, very heartening for me. I've sat in the UN here at the Working Party meetings less than 3 or 4 years ago and had to sit through a shocking presentation by a member of the UN about how animals, particularly cows, were destroying the earth. And so fundamentally for me, again, in defense of that, I raised what I knew at the time about the evolving technologies and things that were happening, but had very little evidence in terms of science or concrete applications. So again, this whole seminar to me has been A, very enlightening, and B, reassuring that, as I always thought, the industry was resilient, but the fact that we've gone to these extra steps is clearly a milestone that I think hopefully the UN will mark, and certainly in our report we'll be marking. So, but just quickly, is there any of the speakers, having heard other speakers, is there anything that you'd like to question one another on, or just reinforce issues on? Because again, where I sit, I think it's really important that we are not deemed to be in competition with one another, that we actually work collaboratively and for everybody to benefit. So I don't know, I'll just throw it open to throw it. Oh, delegate from the US has a question. Thank you.
I have a couple questions. First one's for Ms. Barber. You may recall there was a seaweed extract developed years ago for the use in reducing E. coli in beef cattle. I'm wondering, is there a relationship between these two technologies through mode of action, or no relationship?
Thank you for the question. Unfortunately, I'm not the scientist. I will take that on notice. If you like, I would be very happy to get that question answered for you. I'm not familiar with the seaweed that has so I'm not 100% sure. I'm sorry.
No worries, thank you. The other question was, I think, Dr. Mittliner's presentation on methane. My question is on the amount of methane emitted versus the methane sink. Is either one of those able to reduce or increase, or is it a constant ratio?
I don't think that question was for me.
Okay, now I should be okay. So the question was whether or not the sink and sources, whether they are, I guess, roughly in balance, and the sinks, whether they can be modified. The main sink for methane is called hydroxyl oxidation. It's a process by which molecules are called hydroxyl radicals, meet a methane molecule in the atmosphere, and when they do, they destroy it. And that rate is pretty stable. So we can't really, in any meaningful way, accelerate that or intensify it. It is what it is, and currently it is occurring almost at the same rate that methane is produced from constant sources. I just wanted to say one thing to one of the other speakers from Ireland. I am so excited to see the work that you do on soil carbon sequestration and sequestration in general. I want to just encourage you to keep going, because there's so little information on this end, and it is really urgently needed. So my congratulations, and please keep it up.
And coming from you, Frank, and take that as a compliment, I have to say. Your reputation goes in front of you. And there's still an open invitation to you, Frank. We've met before. I would love you to come and visit us in Ireland. The issue of carbon stocks, whether it's in the soil or whether it's in the trees and hedges, is, as I said, the poor brethren out there. It's the area that we have the biggest knowledge gaps on. And certainly, what we are finding, of course, different soils behave in different ways. And it's really important that, one, well, we're trying to lead in Ireland, but also similar work is done in Australia, similar work is done in California, so that we can actually look at how soils respond in different areas. I think what has moved dramatically on is we've got pioneer engineers who are really helping us access soil cores far easier now than we used to be able to. You know, so the mechanics of that, it's making it a lot easier. And also to the recognition that not only land use, but land management makes a difference. Too much of the policy debate it's a land use debate. And we're saying, no, it's not. It's a land management debate. And that actually needs people managing the land. What we have found on my own farm, we've now found it in several other farms. I have woodland, deciduous woodland that's 300 years old that we sampled. I have silver pastures 120 years old that we sampled. And we also did soil texture classifications so that we compare, are they apples or apples or oranges? So we can look at the clay, the sand, the silt. And what we're actually finding under long-term woodlands, we may manage the trees, but we forget to manage the soils. And what we're seeing is the pH in the soil is dropping. The microbiome in the soil is just like the microbiome in the rumen of a cow, is as the pH drops, the microbiome slows down. And so we have found soil carbon collapsing under long-term trees, which nobody has picked up before, which we're picking up because of the forensic and precision way we're measuring the soils. And it's certainly, I'm passionate about planting trees, but what I'm learning is I need trees, growing trees in a way that I can still manage my soil and manage the microbiome within the soil, because our carbon is not permanent in the soil and it needs that management and it needs people to manage it. So vilifying land managers and putting them all off the land and rewilding the land isn't the answer either.
Thank you, John. So we have a question on, yes, thank you.
We have a hand from Emmanuel Coste online.
No, I have a question on sequestration. In France, our scientists often say that sequestration is there, but it depends on the prairie system. There's a big difference between natural and artificial prairies. That's the first point. The second point, they say that it depends on the management of pasture land. Is there grazing land in your work? Have you studied that? And if you have done, what were the first findings of that work? Thank you. And I want to say thank you to all the panelists, and it was very well organized. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel, for that question. It's a very relevant question. 4 years ago, our company secured a Marie Curie Award from the European Commission, along with Wageningen University Research and University College Dublin. The key variable in that research was looking at different plant species within the grazing platform. In Ireland, and as is the case on the seaboard of Western France, a lot of our grasses are perennial ryegrass, and we use a lot of synthetic nitrogen on. So our research was about reintroducing herbs and legumes. We have 5 PhD students. We're into year 3. We hope by the end of next year, we will have a minimum of 15 peer-reviewed published papers from that work. And what we've found is the more that we bring diversity into the sward that the animal eats, the more that we drive soil biology. And to give you an understanding, we have reduced our synthetic nitrogen fertilizer by 65%. At the same time, we've had a 300% increase in the number of earthworms. We're seeing more carbon and deeper carbon. We're not seeing more carbon in 0 to 10 centimeters, but we are from 10 to 30 centimeters. And that is now what has encouraged us to start sampling below 30 centimeters, is as we switch to more herbs. So the one particularly we're focusing on is a herb called chicory and plantain, but chicory specifically, we're seeing its roots going down 50, 60 centimeters. And so yes, we are seeing a clear link between diversity of the plants there with increasing carbon sequestration. We would also say we are also, because we have a strategy, One Health from soil to society, we are taking the meat right through. So the animals that are on diverse swards are kept on it until they're slaughtered. So we're doing micronutrient analysis of the meat. And it is really interesting to see how meat composition is changing as you change what the animals eat. We have a great saying, you are what you eat. And in fact, you are what you eat eats. And it's really important. So for us, it has been really an eye-opener, and it's been great to do with 5 international PhD students with 2 great universities. It's been a great academic commercial partnership as we've gone through this.
Thank you, John. Was actually on my mind before to raise the issue about impact on the very product that we're producing all the way through. Again, to pick up your phrase, we are what we eat. I mean, fundamentally, I hope that we're able to measure that as well. So we just are in a position, we're just going to go a minute or 2 longer. If there's a pressing question, we are actually at the end of our time, and I apologize for that, but the moderators have agreed to stay on a couple of minutes if there's some pressing questions. Anybody or points that people would like to make? Thank you, John.
Well, mine's more a point, and actually it's to compliment yourself, Chair, and the organization. I've really enjoyed today what you've seen from completely different parts of the world, different approaches to a really important subject. And actually, I don't feel that we get enough opportunity to share like we have shared today. And for me, the take-home message, what I would wish is actually that we could have this kind of forum on a regular basis, that we can exchange our journeys, because we don't have the monopoly of good ideas. There is no silver bullet. It is a collection of different bullets go into, tools go into a toolbox. So for me, what I took out of this today, if I go to Joe and the work that Joe and Future Feed are doing with Asparagopsis, I go to Frank on what they've done in tying into the regulatory framework and the market development for methane reduction. We have a lot of lessons to learn through then to your own verifications and standards. So I think, congratulations to yourself and your secretariat for actually pulling, 5 really interesting groups or journeys together. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, John. And fundamentally for me, very important to thank Pierre, Frank, John and Joanne and Marg. And I think from the UNEC point of view, as the catalyst, if you like, for this opportunity, we will certainly take forward tomorrow through the specialised section the information that we've gleaned from all the presentations, and look forward to seeing how we may be able to facilitate those opportunities going forward into the future. UNEC certainly has a role to play. It isn't an organisation that's going to necessarily take a lead role, but it certainly would like to be part of the facilitation process, and we wish to encourage your cooperation and encourage the research to continue. And certainly, we know that there's a meeting in Ireland coming up, and any way that the UNEC in the future can at least be part of that process, then I'm sure that that'll be an opportunity to be welcomed. So thank you to everybody. Thank you also to the participants online. I do need to draw it to an end, and particularly thank the interpreters on this occasion, because it became fairly scientific and very interesting, but no doubt very challenging from the interpretation's point of view. And I thank you for taking the extra bit of time. So all in all, I wish you well, and thank you, and look forward to hopefully having a similar opportunity at some time in the future. Thank you very much. Thank you.
From the EC Secretary.